Have you ever noticed how the word happiness has become a kind of mantra of our time? It's everywhere. In advertisements promising the perfect life, in social media captions filled with practiced smiles, in modern gurus selling 10 steps to happiness. It's as if happiness were the only goal that truly matters. But, have you ever stopped to ask yourself what it really means to be happy? Or rather, is being happy really possible? The truth is that the closer we look, the more happiness seems like a distant mirror. You see the reflection, you run towards it, but when you get close, it disappears. It is at this moment that an uncomfortable, almost secret feeling arises. Perhaps happiness is not a goal to be achieved, but an illusion that keeps us always chasing after something that never arrives. And this is where our paradox begins. Imagine a common scenario. Someone lands the job they've always wanted. In the first few days, the euphoria is real, almost palpable. But soon, the excitement fades and new worries arise. Deadlines, responsibilities, comparisons with colleagues, the fear of losing the position they've earned. This cycle repeats itself in almost everything. Buying a car, starting a relationship, even realizing a dream. What seemed like the end of one quest actually turns out to be just the beginning of another. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard described something similar when he spoke of the anguish of freedom. The feeling that no matter what we achieve, there's always a lack that haunts us. And perhaps it's precisely this lack that drives us forward. But Schopenhauer, the thinker who guides our reflection, was even more radical. He believed that life by nature is suffering. That pleasure is nothing more than a momentary pause, a brief suspension of pain. Before we delve into Schopenhauer's dark, and yet liberating thought, we need to acknowledge something. We have all, on some level, felt this. Think about the moment you open your social media feed. There are people traveling, smiling, getting married, buying houses, living their dream lives. In comparison, your own life seems insufficient. You feel indebted to yourself, as if you haven't yet reached the point where true happiness would finally begin. This mechanism isn't accidental. It's fueled. Modern society has learned to sell happiness as a product. And every time you think you're about to acquire it, you discover that the version you acquired is already outdated. It's a race with no finish line. But why do we run? Maybe because we are afraid of the silence that appears when we stop. Deep down, we fear the possibility that there is no such thing as complete happiness, and that life is made of something else, less shiny, more raw. Here arises the first provocation of our journey. What if happiness is not the goal of life? What if this constant search is just a trick to keep the gears of desire running? This question isn't comfortable. It threatens an entire culture based on goals, achievements, accomplishments, and comparisons. But it is precisely discomfort that opens up space for thinking. And it is in this void, in this silence between one promise and another, that Schopenhauer enters. A philosopher who was not afraid to say what we all feel but rarely dare to admit, that happiness may be just a mirage, an illusory construct that keeps us occupied but never fulfilled. This is just the beginning. The question of happiness as a mirage naturally leads us to a thinker who was unafraid to face life without veils, Schopenhauer. He believed that suffering was not an exception, but the very rule of existence. And perhaps it's time to look this uncomfortable idea in the face. Not as pessimism, but as a mirror that can reveal what we try to hide from ourselves. But first, let this provocation remain with you. When was the last time you believed you would finally be happy, and how long did that feeling last? Perhaps the answer is the indication that Schopenhauer was right. If this reflection gave you pause, perhaps it's because part of you already knew. Sign up to continue this journey through the human paradox together. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788. In a Europe still breathing the winds of the French Revolution and seeing new promises of human progress emerge. While many philosophers of the time believed in reason, scientific advancement, and Enlightenment optimism, Schopenhauer took the opposite direction. He looked at life without filters, without the illusions that calm most people, and saw something that few had the courage to admit. Existence is, by nature, suffering. For him, the engine that moves us is not reason or morality, but a blind, irrational force, which he called will to live. An incessant energy that pushes us to desire, conquer, consume and repeat this cycle without ever reaching rest. And it is precisely this desire, impossible to satisfy, that guarantees our unhappiness. Imagine a foam. The moment it appears, we feel pain, discomfort, and impatience. When we eat, we experience pleasure, but this pleasure is short-lived. Soon hunger returns. This is the pattern of life, a constant alternation between pain and relief, but never between pain and true peace. Schopenhauer stated that pleasure is nothing more than a temporary suspension of pain. Just as quenching thirst doesn't mean overcoming dehydration forever, satisfying a craving doesn't mean being happy. It just means being momentarily free from the anguish that craving caused. And if we look closely, this dynamic is present in almost everything. In love, which begins as ecstasy and soon becomes mixed with jealousy, insecurity, and fear of loss. At work, which brings fulfillment, but also demands comparison and exhaustion. Even in leisure, which often turns into boredom or the need to look for something new, more exciting. What's most frightening about Schopenhauer's philosophy isn't just the assertion that life is suffering. It's the fact that, on some level, we all know this to be true. It's uncomfortable but familiar. Who has never experienced that feeling that, after achieving what seemed to be the goal of life, the satisfaction lasted only a few moments before dissolving? It's like chasing a mirage in the desert. The image of water is always there ahead, but every step towards it only makes it recede. Perhaps this is why Schopenhauer disliked the word happiness. For him, speaking of happiness was like speaking of eternal silence in the midst of a war. Impossible. At most, we could talk about absence of suffering, like a temporary pause between two pains. This view seems too harsh for our modern sensibilities. After all, we live surrounded by messages that say the opposite, that we can, and should, be happy all the time. But doesn't this constant promise make us even sicker? If we pay attention, we realize how Schopenhauer's philosophy anticipates much of what we feel today. We live in a culture that tells us to constantly desire new products, new experiences, new relationships, new versions of ourselves. But the more we desire, the more we become slaves to that desire. Schopenhauer saw this clearly. Desire is a prison that never opens. It moves us, keeps us alive, but it also condemns us to eternal dissatisfaction. And when, by chance, we experience a moment of contentment, be it a passionate kiss, a professional achievement, or an afternoon of silence, we feel something curious, a secret anxiety that it will end. And indeed it ends. A biographical detail helps to understand this pessimism. Schopenhauer grew up in a wealthy family, but one marked by tragedy. His father, a prosperous merchant, committed suicide. His mother, a socially active writer, had a distant relationship with him. From an early age, Arthur learned that behind the mask of respectability and success lay pain, loss, and loneliness. This raw outlook on life shaped his entire philosophy. But make no mistake, his vision wasn't just bitterness. It was also a kind of radical sincerity. Schopenhauer believed that by stopping pretending life is a fairy tale, we gain a strange form of freedom. Because after all, if we don't expect perfection, maybe we can live more honestly. It is at this point that an interesting tension arises. If happiness is an illusion, how can we continue living? If life is pain, what is the point of enduring it? Schopenhauer didn't offer a comforting answer. But he did point to paths: art, aesthetic contemplation, and compassion for others. Moments when we can suspend, even if only for a short time, the crushing weight of the will to live. When we hear a song that moves us, when we are moved by a sunset, or when we see in the suffering of others a reflection of our own. In those moments, according to him, we are able to escape, even if briefly, from the tyranny of desires. This is not an easy view to accept. But perhaps that's precisely why it resonates so much with those who are tired of easy promises. There is a strange honesty in hearing someone say, life hurts, and that pain is not a defect, it is the rule. As if, deep down, Schopenhauer was simply putting into words what we have all felt but are afraid to confess. Now, let this idea resonate with you. What if happiness is just the temporary absence of pain? What if everything we call being happy is nothing more than brief intervals, sparks in the darkness, which soon fade away? Perhaps by accepting this, we can begin to see life with fewer masks and more clarity. Perhaps the real illusion is not unhappiness, but the belief that one day we will be able to eliminate it completely. Schopenhauer wrote in the 19th century, long before the invention of the internet, digital marketing, or the apps we carry in our pockets today. And yet it seems he was describing exactly the logic that governs our age, the infinite promise of happiness that is never fulfilled. If in the past this promise came from religions, kings, or political ideologies, today it is disguised as advertisements, filters, and slogans. The modern world has learned to transform human desire into fuel. And what does he sell? Always the same product but with different packaging: happiness. Just look at a social network. Their life is not shown as it is, but as it should be. Smiles frozen in carefully edited photos. Trips displayed not to be experienced but to be seen. Relationships performed in public, as if love were only valid when approved by red hearts on a screen. The silent message is always the same: look how full life can be, and see how yours isn't there yet. The result? Anxiety, comparison, the feeling of always being in debt to one's own existence. Schopenhauer said that pleasure is just the interruption of pain. In the 21st century, this pleasure has become a like, a comment, a notification. Small doses of dopamine that function as micro breaks, but which soon wear off, pushing us to seek more. It is an almost cruel mechanism. Happiness has been transformed into a digital addiction. Sociologist Sigmund Bauman called our time liquid modernity, an era in which nothing remains, everything slips through your fingers. Relationships, jobs, beliefs, even identities. Everything is disposable, replaceable, temporary. And in this liquidity, the promise of happiness becomes even more insatiable. Today it is not enough to be happy. It is necessary to look happy. You need to prove to others, and to yourself, that you are living a life worthy of envy. And here a paradox arises. The more we display happiness, the more we distrust it. Who has never looked at a feed full of smiles and thought, is all this real? Modern psychology has already identified the consequences of this logic. Constant comparison creates chronic anxiety, feelings of inadequacy, and a seemingly bottomless void. Physician and thinker Gabor Mate calls this internal void hole, a space we try to fill with distractions, consumption, drugs, sex, work, or having fun. But, as he states, no external pleasure can fill a pain that originates within. This silent pain is what keeps us stuck in the cycle. We desire, we achieve, we become frustrated, and then we desire again. Like rats on a wheel, we spin endlessly, believing that at some point we will finally reach the promised complete happiness. But is there an end point? Or is happiness just the carrot dangled in front of the horse? A trick that keeps the body moving but can never be achieved? The modern world has intensified this dynamic in ways that Schopenhauer perhaps could not have imagined. Today, desire is not just born within us. It is manufactured, designed, and implanted. The algorithm knows our weaknesses better than we do. It knows what we desire before we even realize it. And, like an invisible machine, it feeds us carefully chosen images to keep us wanting more. If Schopenhauer were alive today, he might say that human suffering not only continues, but has been industrialized. The pain of never being happy has been turned into a market. And each of us, by scrolling endlessly, becomes both a consumer and a product of this mechanism. But there is an even crueler point. The promise of happiness is not only unattainable, it is also contradictory. Because for the system to work, you cannot be fully satisfied. If I had, I wouldn't buy it anymore, I wouldn't click anymore, I wouldn't search anymore. Modern culture needs your dissatisfaction to continue existing. Therefore, she takes care of keeping him always in short supply. No matter what you achieve, there will soon be something new, better, more up-to-date, more desirable. It's as if your whole life has been transformed into a showcase. And we, exhausted, continue looking behind the glass, believing that happiness is always in the next object, the next trip, the next relationship, the next me. Maybe you've already felt this. That euphoria of buying something you really wanted, and the strange feeling of emptiness right after. The relief of finally being recognized, praised, validated, and the discomfort that returns silently days later. This movement is not a flaw. It is exactly how the gear was designed. But here comes the uncomfortable question. If happiness is just a modern mirage, what is left of truth in the human experience? Is life just this endless cycle of desire and frustration? Schopenhauer left us this provocation, and perhaps it is time to face it without fear. Happiness, as we understand it, may never exist. But does this mean that life is meaningless? Or is there another kind of value, different from pleasure and immediate gratification, that can give depth to our existence? This is the tension that leads us to the next paradox. Perhaps we should not seek happiness, but rather the ability to find meaning in suffering. If Schopenhauer shows us that happiness is just a mirage, the inevitable question arises: how can we endure a life that seems condemned to suffering? Our culture's most common response is simple: seek pleasure, accumulate experiences, fill the void with achievements. But does this escape really work? Nietzsche believed not. For him, suffering was not just inevitable, it was essential. While Schopenhauer saw pain as a burden to be borne, Nietzsche saw it as a creative force, a fire that, instead of destroying, forges. Imagine iron being placed in a forge. The extreme heat softens it, the hammer shapes it, and only after the shock and pressure does it transform into something new, stronger. Nietzsche saw human beings in the same way. Without pain, without loss, without challenge, there is no true transformation. That's why he wrote, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Not as a cheap self-help slogan, but as an existential observation. Pain, when faced, makes us deeper. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a survivor of Nazi concentration camps, echoed this same intuition in his classic In Search of Meaning. Between hunger, cold, and daily death, he realized that those who had a purpose, even a small one, endured more than those who simply sought to escape the pain. Frankl wrote, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." This sentence contains a silent revolution. She suggests that we don't need to eliminate suffering in order to live. We need to turn it into direction, into meaning. And here's the paradox. The happiness we so desperately pursue may be just a shadow, but the suffering we so fear may be the path to a more authentic life. This does not mean that we should deliberately seek pain. It just means that when it shows up, and it always does, we don't have to treat it like an enemy. We can look at her as a teacher. Modern culture tries to convince us that pain is a sign of failure. If you suffer, it's because you weren't positive enough, you didn't attract good energy, you didn't consume enough, you didn't follow the right recipe. This discourse creates a generation of people who, in addition to suffering, still feel guilty for suffering. But Nietzsche and Frankl point another way. What if suffering is not a mistake but part of the fabric of life? What if fulfillment comes not from eliminating pain, but from moving through it with purpose? Think of a climber who decides to climb a mountain. He knows he will face cold, exhaustion, fear. And yet he rises. Why? Because the meaning of reaching the summit gives value to sacrifice. If we took the suffering out of climbing, we would also take away its greatness. Maybe life works the same way. It's not about escaping the pain, but about giving it a framework that transforms it into something bearable, even beautiful. Nietzsche called this process amor fati, the love of destiny. Not just accepting what life brings but affirming, even loving, every part of it, including the suffering. It's a radical stance, saying yes not only to joys but also to tragedies. Frankl, in his experience in the concentration camps, lived exactly this. He didn't romanticize the horror. But he realized that even there, moments of meaning could be found, in helping another prisoner, in holding on to a memory, in keeping hope alive. The suffering did not disappear, but it became bearable because it had a reason. This paradox, suffering as a source of meaning, directly confronts the modern promise of happiness. While society screams, eliminate pain, maximize pleasure, the deepest thinkers tell us, face the pain and in it you will find something greater than pleasure. It's a risky invitation, almost unbearable for a world accustomed to numbing any discomfort with quick distractions. But perhaps that is precisely why we live so empty, because we have lost the art of suffering with purpose. And now I come back to you. Think about a difficult time in your life. Perhaps a loss, a failure, a phase of silent pain. At the time it seemed unbearable. But looking back, wasn't that very experience what shaped part of who you are today? It's as if suffering, unlike happiness, has a depth that marks us forever. Moments of pleasure are sweet, but they pass quickly. Pain, when reinterpreted, can become roots that sustain our existence. If happiness is a mirage, perhaps suffering is the ground. A hard, rough, but real ground. And perhaps it is on this ground, and not on the glittering illusions of happiness, that we can build something solid. Nietzsche and Frankl do not deny pain. They just put it in another light, not as a curse but as a possibility. And in this shift, they open the door to something that goes beyond the search for happiness. If Nietzsche and Frankl point to pain as the path to meaning, contemporary psychology shows us why, even in an age of technological advances, comforts and opportunities, we are increasingly unhappy. After all, we've never had so much, and yet we've never felt so empty. Carl Jung believed that one of the main reasons for this malaise lies in what he called shadow. The shadow is everything we reject in ourselves. Our weaknesses, fears, repressed desires, vulnerabilities. Instead of integrating these parts, we try to hide them, creating an acceptable version of who we are for the world. We live divided. On one side, the social mask we show, on the other, the shadow we deny. But what we repress doesn't disappear. It returns, in the form of anxiety, guilt, uncontrolled impulses, or even a diffuse feeling of emptiness. And here's the crux. The happiness we seek outside of ourselves rarely satisfies us because within us there is an unresolved conflict. We cannot be happy because we spend our lives trying to escape ourselves. Jung said that individuation, that is, the process of becoming whole, requires precisely the opposite. Facing the shadow, integrating what we avoid, reconciling ourselves with our most uncomfortable parts. But this work requires courage. And courage is something that our culture, obsessed with positivity, often tries to stifle. Modern psychology also shows how the too many options paralyzes us. We live in a society where anything seems possible. Thousands of careers, relationships, lifestyles. But this abundance, instead of freeing us, suffocates us. Barry Schwartz, an American psychologist, called this the paradox of choice. The more options we have, the more anxious we become, because each choice we make means giving up all the others. And so we find ourselves faced with a happiness that is always postponed, because each decision carries with it the weight of doubt. What if there was a better option? In addition, there is the culture of toxic positivity, which turns suffering into a taboo. Today we are expected to smile in every photo, to publish our achievements, to maintain a constant narrative of success. But real life is made up of failures, losses, frustrations, and since we can't show this, we live in dissonance. Psychologist Brené Brown, known for her work on vulnerability, reminds us that denying our most painful emotions doesn't make us stronger, but rather more fragile. When we hide our sadness, our anger, or our loneliness, we don't eliminate them, we just let them grow in the darkness. It's curious to see how the promise of happiness has become a silent obligation. If you're not happy, that's your problem. You didn't read the right book, you didn't do the right therapy, you didn't practice gratitude enough, you didn't follow the trendy method. This logic, instead of liberating, imprisons. It turns happiness into a new kind of tyranny. We fail to be happy not because we fail, but because we confuse happiness with a constant state of pleasure. And the more we try to reach it, the more it eludes us. Contemporary anxiety arises precisely from this race. We live projected towards the future. When we get the right job, the perfect relationship, the dream trip, then we will be happy. But when the future arrives, it never lives up to its promise. And so we live in an endless line of postponements, always believing that happiness is just beyond the next goal. Psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan called this metonymic desire, a desire that is never satisfied, that jumps from one object to another, always promising fulfillment, but always leaving a residue of lack. And perhaps it is precisely this lack that constitutes us as human. At this point, we return to the initial question. Why can't we be happy? Perhaps because the very idea of happiness as a permanent state is an illusion. Perhaps because we are looking outside for something that requires a deep dive inside. Or perhaps because, by denying our shadow and fearing pain, we are running away from precisely that which could give us true meaning. Think about your own life. How many times have you believed that you would be happy when you reached a certain milestone? A degree, an achievement, a relationship. And when you got there, how long did the feeling last? Happiness, in this model, is always a moving point which moves away every time we try to reach it. And yet, perhaps it is precisely in this movement, in this emptiness that insists on remaining, that the key to something deeper than happiness lies hidden: authenticity. Jung would tell us that the path is not to avoid pain but to integrate it. It is not about erasing the shadow but illuminating it. It's not about masking our vulnerability, but embracing it as part of who we are. Because perhaps, deep down, the question is not how to be happy, but how to be whole. And being whole is not about always being well. It is about embracing the complexity of existence with its lights and shadows, its joys and losses. And here's the final shocker. Happiness, as it is sold to us, is too simple for the depth of the human condition. We want a life that makes sense, and meaning inevitably involves pain. We cannot be happy because we were not made for a straight line of pleasure. We were made for paradox. And perhaps, by accepting this, we can stop chasing the mirage and finally walk towards what is real. Schopenhauer, with his almost cruel lucidity, might have had much to say to our time. He would see, with a certain sarcasm, that we still believe in the promise of lasting happiness. He would laugh, not because he was cynical, but because he had already realized that life is woven of contradictions, and that every pleasure carries within it the seed of dissatisfaction. The philosopher doesn't invite us to give up on life, but to face it without the illusions that imprison us. For him, the search for eternal happiness is like chasing a bird's shadow. The more we run, the more it escapes. What remains then? Not permanent joy, but the serenity that arises from understanding. Perhaps true wisdom lies in accepting that pain is not a flaw in the system, but part of the very machinery of existence. Suffering, rather than being an obstacle to life, is what makes us feel its weight and depth. It is the contrast that shapes what we call joy. And here is the warning Schopenhauer seems to leave us. The more we insist on making happiness a goal, the more we will lose ourselves in frustration. But if we look at life not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood, perhaps we will find a space of peace. Not the artificial peace of anesthesia, but the peace of those who accept the flow of reality as it is, imperfect, unpredictable, paradoxical. The illusion of happiness is ultimately a prison, because it forces us to live in constant debt to an ideal that is never fulfilled. But when we recognize that life doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful, the prison dissolves. We discover that we can walk even amidst the shadows, and that there is beauty even in what hurts us. Schopenhauer reminds us then that the point is not to seek happiness, but rather to learn to endure life with dignity. He would say that if there is any form of freedom, it lies not in avoiding pain, but in learning to inhabit it. Because pain, unlike the illusion of happiness, is real, and it is only in the face of reality that we can become true. We may never be happy in the absolute sense that modern culture bombards us with, but we can be lucid, we can be whole, we can be authentic. And deep down, this is perhaps deeper than happiness. It's what allows us to live without masks, without illusions, with our feet firmly on the ground of reality. So, at the end of it all, the question remains: do you still insist on seeking happiness as a fixed destination, or are you willing to accept the human paradox of living between light and shadow, pleasure and pain, illusion and truth? This choice, silent and intimate, is the only one that really matters. If this reflection resonated with you, remember, the search isn't for eternal happiness, but for a life that makes sense. Subscribe to The Human Paradox and join me on this journey of discovery, where every question matters more than any answer.